And it's always a privilege to interact with students who are preparing for competitive exams and for other similar, initiatives. So, as Lena mentioned, I've been working in climate action space for quite some time, and this topic is also something on which we have been very closely working for last 4 or 5 years. We have some interesting research and some of our sort of work to share with all of you today. So I'll not take much of your time and directly jump to the presentation that we had. So I think we all know that before SDG there was something called as Millennium Development Goals, and after that UN decided that more progress needs to be done, and Global South region needs to take more accountability and more ownership in terms of developing various sectors, including education, health, environment, gender, and that is how SDGs were created. And now we have a timeline till 2030 by which we have to track and basically complete most of the SDGs that we have today. And out of all the 17 SDGs that we have SDG 11, which specifically talks about the component of urbanization, sustainable cities, and sustainable urban living, which is also the topic for today's webinar. So if you can please go to the next slide. So SDG 11 basically says that how we can make our cities and our urban spaces more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And as you all know, today climate crisis is one of the most pressing issues for our urban settings, and that is why this entire concept of creating smart and resilient and sustainable cities is therefore important. And even if you look at this issue through the lens of data, you can actually try and see that most of the population today is, I mean, not most, but rising, increasingly, a lot of population is now coming into the urban areas. So at present, if we talk about India, almost 30% of the population is residing in urban areas. This number is projected to go up to 40% by 2030, which is also the last year for the SDGs implementation, and 50% by 2050. So you can understand that the rate of urbanization is actually rapid when we are talking about this data, right? So by 2050, half of the country's population will actually be living in these urban areas. And when more and more population is actually influxing these urban areas, the result is actually the stress on the resources and the infrastructure that we already have. And this is needless to say that most of the infrastructure and resources that we have today are already limited, be it physical infrastructure, be it natural infrastructure, be it economic infrastructure. So we are limited by these resources, and as and when more and more population keeps on influxing, the resources in the urban settings actually get strained, and they have more stress on themselves. And this is just a simple kind of perspective to look at under SDG 11, what are the components that we're trying to look, right? So the other way to also look at it is, if we are talking about how to make our cities more sustainable, what all components we need to work on. So housing, transport, inclusive urbanization, sanitation, waste management, environmental impact, green and public spaces, disaster risk reduction. I'm sure a few days back you must have seen on social media that Thailand and Myanmar were struck by massive earthquakes and landslides. But fortunately, the urban planning in those cities, in those countries, is so that Thailand incur very less damage in terms of its infrastructure and other services, because the way their urban planning is designed is quite sustainable and resilient that way. So that is why SDG 11 also has certain sub targets. And if we want to achieve SDG 11 by 2030, these are the components on which we need to work. And maybe some of these sub targets I'll talk about in detail when we come to the major part of this presentation, which is our work on heat management. Next slide, please. Great. So again, I'm not going into the formal definition of what urbanization is, because I'm assuming most of you might be aware of what urbanization is, but maybe it can just be categorized as the migration that people do from rural areas to urban areas in search of better opportunities. It can be in terms of employment, it can be in terms of education, health, or more economic opportunities. And then, as I already mentioned, right now the state of urbanization is somewhat 31% in India, which is projected to go to 40% by 2030, and then 50% by 2050. And then if you look at different, metrics to know how Indian cities have been performing, the most valuable, I would say, the metrics is actually the global livability index. And most of you will be surprised to know that for last many years, no Indian city has been able to attain the top 20, top 30, top 50 spot in the global livability index. What does that mean? It simply means that most of the cities are not designed in a way where our livability standards or our livability frameworks can actually kind of improve. And that's something which is actually very sort of concerning, because when we talk about our cities and when we talk about more and more people migrating to urban settings, it is important that we end up providing basic sort of amenities in these urban settings. And that is why the global livability index doesn't mention most of the cities in the top 20 or top 30 or top 50 sort of lists. So can you go to the next slide, please? So when we talk about urbanization, so as I was saying, that as more and more population sort of moves to the urban areas, it kind of stresses out our existing systems. And the kind of stress that this influx creates can actually be divided into three parts: economic, environmental, and social. So economic, again, the economic resources that we have are very less. So just to put it in simple words, we anyway don't have much job opportunities in the urban sort of region. And when more and more influx keeps on happening, this results in stagnation of wages, stagnation of job opportunities, and also the space for formal work settings also kind of shrinks. So this is one of the impact that rising urbanization is having in terms of economic sense. And when we talk about environmental sense, which we'll also talk in the coming slide, is again the stress that the rising influx has on existing resources, that it can be in terms of water bodies, waste management, also the construction which is happening in most of the cities, air pollution, which is a major issue in almost every city now that we live in. And then social, we can already see a lot of caste and religious divide in the city. We can also see how our basic services like healthcare and education are scattered. And as and when more and more population moves to these urban areas, these differences again kind of they keep on increasing. And that is just a simple way of looking what kind of challenges rising urbanization can cause. Next slide, please. So this is something which is very interesting, and as an organization, we have been working on this topic for a very long time now. So we have been trying to understand how the problem of rising heat has been impacting different populations in urban settings. And when we talk about communities, these are basically the vulnerable community, right? So for maybe like people like you and me, we have coolers, ACs, and maybe like 24 into 7 power to kind of face the challenge that rising heat is causing. But maybe for those living in slums or street vendors or people like gig workers who spend most of the times on street for their livelihoods might not have that kind of options. And that is why this problem of urban heat stress is something which we immediately need to kind of pay attention to. And this does not only cause like environmental sort of hazard, but it's also a health problem. So a lot of people who spend long time on streets or under the direct heat exposure are also like they also incur some kind of health problems, as it is very understandable. And also it causes an economic loss. So a lot of recent studies and evidence has shown us that as and when the heat will rise, the number of productive hours will also kind of decrease. So especially for the labor class or construction workers or migrant workers who spend a lot of time doing outdoor laborious work, basically for them, the economic productivity will also kind of decrease. And to simply understand it, there's nothing like a rocket science kind of thing behind it, but basically, more and more construction that we are doing without putting a sustainable sort of idea behind it is one of the major reasons why we are seeing the temperatures within our cities is kind of rising or shooting up. Then we also need to pay attention to different materials which we use to develop our cities. So, for example, most of the roads that we built in our cities is of material which absorbs heat rather than reflecting it, and that is why you see during the daytime it is very difficult to actually travel on the road. And then there are other things like encroachment of water bodies, cutting of green shade, which actually directly impacts the temperature rise in our cities. Next slide, please. And basically, we had this interesting data which we tried to show in the last slide. So I'm sure most of you are aware of the Himalayan states that we have. So last year, actually, the problem with heat stress was so intense that states like Himachal and Uttarakhand also end up witnessing heat waves actually. So you can actually imagine the extent of this problem now. So it is no more a problem that you'll see in states which are plain or which are based in plateau sort of settings, but also the Himalayan states are now facing the increasing problem of heat stress. And again, this is something which I already talked about. So the vulnerable populations that we have, like gig workers, daily wage laborers, they are the primary victims when it comes to the rising temperature. And again, it is not just about their health, but also about their livelihood because they don't really have choice to sit back at home under AC, cooler, fans, or whatever, and kind of face it. And if you actually look at numbers, these are also very contradictory. So right now, there is no central sort of data keeping for cases related to heat stress. So Ministry of Health has its own sort of system for recording heat deaths. National Disaster for Management has its own system of recording heat related injuries and deaths. So basically, there's no uniformity when we talk about measuring the impact of heat stress on human health and population. So that's also something which as students, as researchers, you can try and look into that. Can we have a more uniform and standardized data management system when we talk about measuring the impact of heat strokes or sorry heat on human health and the larger population. uh, yeah, next slide please. So I'm not going into too much detail because I also have to pass it to Tamas sir next. So I think if you talk about what cities are doing to kind of address this problem, so I think one encouraging example is from Ahmedabad in Gujarat. So a lot of initiatives are being taken, and one major initiative is the Cool Roofs program that is being implemented in Ahmedabad right now. It is by the government in collaboration with an NGO called Mahila Housing Trust (MHT). It has been working in the region for a very long time, and they have been implementing a program called Cool Roofs program, under which they basically try and provide cooling solutions to the low household population. And these, so basically, you can try and understand it in terms of people living in urban areas, right? They don't have adequate ventilation systems, they don't have cooling systems. So for them to implement something like this is actually a very, I would say, positive sort of step. And the results are also very encouraging. So almost 400 households were selected in the first phase of this project, and all the 400 households have shared that after implementing this Cool Roofs program, they have actually found some relief from the rising temperature, which is actually a very big problem in Ahmedabad. And Ahmedabad was also the first city in India to come up with a heat action plan. And they have been updating this heat action plan every 2 years or so. So that's also something for other cities to learn and see where these changes and adjustments can be made when we are talking about policy frameworks. Next slide. So yeah, I'll quickly talk about solutions. So I think in terms of legal framework, if there are students from law background, then maybe for them a good area to look is into the National Disaster Safety Act, which we have. So that act doesn't notify heat wave as a national disaster so far, and there have been some petitions in the Supreme Court to say that basically there's a need to notify heat wave as a national disaster. The impact or the implication of that is basically will basically be that the states and the center will be able to coordinate a response when the temperature is rising in different cities, and the fund allocation process will also be getting improved. That's one benefit of notifying heat wave as disaster. Then improving local governance. So I think under the constitution also the urban local bodies are considered as autonomous bodies. But when we talk about it in realistic sense, not many state governments or central government actually allow local bodies to have that autonomy and decision making powers, right? So we need to empower our local bodies to have more financial autonomy, regulatory decision making autonomy. So they'll be better placed to know that, okay, if this is a region which is having a more heat stress compared to other parts of the cities, then they'll be in a better sort of position to implement those local solutions and have a more robust response to the problem of heat stress. And climate resilient planning, again, we have a mixture of nature-based solutions and technical solutions that we can implement for containing the temperature in our cities. But I think the idea of having more sustainable construction, more sustainable buildings, preserving the tree shade that we have in our cities today is just one way to look at it. And also to share through an example, the recent incident that happened in Hyderabad. That's also something which we can try and look into, because these urban forests are basically they act as a buffer between the settings and the temperature rise that we see. So I think it's very important that we end up protecting these urban spaces, urban green spaces, I would say. Last slide, please. Again, I think on this, Government of India has initiated some policy measures. So they have started talking about how there's more and more need to introduce measures to protect workers from heat when they're working in professional settings. But this is more important for informal sector, because as we know, informal sector doesn't have much of the protection anyway. And when we're talking about something as serious as heat, then there needs to be much more interventions in place which can actually end up protecting these workers from the rising temperature. And at present, we have case of gig workers and construction workers who end up working in intense heat during the peak day hours, and they don't even have adequate sanitation or water or cooling facilities, right? So that's just one way of looking at it. So basically, I've tried to wrap up these solutions in different kind of categories, but this is a mixture of long-term and mid-term solutions that we need to look at, and it will be basically a combination of policy level solutions as well as some community level solutions that we need to put together and protect our cities from becoming basically unlivable. So that is it from my end, and maybe we have like 4 or 5 minutes. If there are any questions from the students, I'll be happy to take it up.